Today, the real employment story. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, yesterday the ABS released their latest employment statistics for January, and there was much celebration in mainstream media and in Parliament about the fact that the numbers were pretty good, except, of course, they're telling you only half the story. So today I want to go through what the ABS said, but then explore some of the other statistics, which gives us a better perspective as to what's really going on. Seasonally adjusted hours worked fell by 8.8% between December and January, according to the latest from the ABS. The changes in hours worked were more pronounced than for the other key indicators, with employment increasing by around 13,000 people, they said. Unemployment was 6,000 people, and the unemployment rate remained at 4.2%. The ABS said the large falls in hours worked in January 2022 reflected more people than usual taking annual leave and sick leave in the first 2 weeks of January. This was a period with high numbers of COVID cases associated with the Omicron variant and considerable disruption across the labour market. Last year, in January 2021, the large 4.9% fall in hours worked mainly reflected more people than usual taking annual leave. At that time, there were relatively low numbers of active cases of COVID and only localised impacts. While we again saw higher than usual numbers of people taking annual leave, even more so than last year, the 8.8% fall in hours worked in January 2022 also reflected much higher than usual numbers of people on sick leave. This echoes what we saw in the recent ABS business survey, they said, on COVID-related absences. Nationally and in New South Wales and Victoria, the number of people who worked reduced hours because they were sick was around 3 times the pre-pandemic average for January. In other states and territories, it was twice as many people. In fact, Western Australia was the only jurisdiction with a usual low number of people working reduced hours in January because they were sick. The number of people working no hours at all in a week because they were sick was particularly high at more than 4 times the pre-pandemic average. January is the middle of summer, and usually only around 90,000 to 100,000 people in Australia are away from work sick for an entire week. But in January 2022, it was around 450,000. That's 3.4% of employed people, the ABS said. The January 2022 figures were also much higher than in the winter months in Australia, when sick leave has usually peaked in August at around 140,000 to 170,000 people, they said. The fall in seasonally adjusted hours worked was greatest in New South Wales and Victoria at 13.5% and 13.2%. Western Australia was the only part of Australia where hours increased up 1.7%. Despite the fall in hours worked, employment increased in January 2022 by 13,000 people, with flows into employment continuing to outpace flows out of employment. This followed a similar pattern to January 2021. The increase in people who worked fewer hours or no hours at all due to illness, personal injury or sick leave was mostly seen in younger age groups. And younger people were particularly impacted by illness, personal injury or sick leave, with much higher numbers of people working no hours because they were sick. For example, there were 93,500 20 to 24-year-olds in January 2022, compared with 10,600 in January 2020. As with earlier rapid changes in the labour market during the pandemic, hours continued to be much more affected than employment. This reflects people working reduced or no hours without necessarily losing their jobs, the ABS said. Seasonally adjusted unemployment increased by 6,000 people in January, with the unemployment rate remaining at 4.2%. The participation rate increased 0.1 percentage points to 63.2%, near its all-time high of 66.3%. That was in March 2021. And female participation rose to a new record high in January at 62.1%, which was around 0.9 percentage points higher than the start of the pandemic. That was even more pronounced for women aged 15 to 64 years of age at 76.2%, which was 1.9 percentage points above the start of the pandemic and 7 percentage points below men, the ABS said. The youth unemployment rate fell 0.4 percentage points to 9% in January, and the youth participation rate fell 0.7 percentage points to 69.8%. So the underemployment rate rose 0.1 percentage points to 6.7%, and that was 2.1 percentage points lower than the March 2020 when it was 8.8%. The underemployment data released in the ABS labour force data is time-related underemployment. Time-related underemployment reflects an employee who desires and is available for additional working hours. The underutilisation rate, which combines the unemployment rate and the underemployment rates, increased 0.1 percentage points to 10.9% and was 3.2 percentage points lower than its March 2020 level when it was 14.1%. But we need to ask what is really going on here. And in fact, Bill Mitchell, the professor in economics and director of the Centre for Full Employment and Equity at the University of Newcastle, said the Australian labour market is now larger than it was in February 2020, but it is still a long way from where it would have been if it had continued to expand at the previous trend. The flat population growth, as external borders remain largely closed, or there is a slow take-up of international travel opportunities from foreign tourists, has helped keep the unemployment rate low as employment growth slows dramatically. It is sometimes useful to examine the employment to population ratio because the underlying population estimates are less cyclical and subject to variation than the labour force estimates. The denominator, the population, is clearly providing favourable pressures due to the slower population growth as a result of the lack of immigration arising from the external border closures. This is forcing employers to search harder for workers already in Australia rather than discriminating against the unemployed. And in fact, this graph shows Australia's working age population over 15-year-old from January 2015 to January 2022. With the external borders still largely closed, immigration has shrunk to virtually zero, and the impact is very clear. This flattening out has forced employers to work harder to get workers and is one of the reasons unemployment is falling quite quickly, given the circumstances. The federal government, of course, is now working against the workers by offering enticements for people to come on foreign visas to increase the labour supply under the guise of worker shortages. And as Leith Van Onselen commented in Macro Business Today, over recent weeks, some economists have tried to argue that Australia's plummeting jobless rate has been driven purely by stimulus and has little to do with the closure of Australia's international border to immigration. While stimulus certainly prevented the economy from sliding into a deep recession, it has merely filled the hole left by COVID lockdowns and restrictions and has failed to put the economy on a higher trajectory. This is illustrated clearly by the fact that employment growth is tracking well below the pre-COVID trend. The collapse in the unemployment and underemployment rates have also not been driven by people giving up looking for work. Australia's participation rate in January at 63.4% was higher than in February 2020 before the pandemic commenced, when it was 62.5%. The only explanation for why Australia's unemployment and underemployment rates have fallen so heavily is because labour supply has stopped growing thanks to the sharp fall in immigration. Had immigration continued at its pre-COVID level, Australia's civilian population aged over 16 would be roughly 480,000 larger than it is currently. And in turn, both unemployment and underemployment would be significantly higher, and the employment to population ratio would be much lower due to an increase in the denominator. In fact, independent economist Saul Eslake noted similarly last year when he said the longer our borders remain closed to international migrants, the easier it is for the targets for unemployment to be achieved. And here is a further twist. Youth unemployment has fallen to its lowest level since June 2008, 9%, despite rising participation over the pandemic, because the 15 to 24 civilian population has shrunk by 168,000 over the pandemic as temporary migrants have gone home, and in turn more jobs have been made available for young Australians. And Leith concluded his piece saying, any economist claiming that the collapse in Australia's unemployment and underemployment rate have little to do with the sharp reversal in immigration is either lying or stupid. The proof is in the data, and it is undeniable. In fact, you can join a live discussion with him next week on my weekly show, Tuesday at 8 p.m. Sydney time. So much to discuss. But the takeout from all of this is that the mainstream spin is not telling the full story of our employment number. And the likelihood is that if migration is ramped up, unemployment rates will rise and income growth will remain anemic at best. Yet, of course, the big Australia mob are seeking just that. And I'll also make the other point that reduction in hours means reduction in income. And so we are seeing in our stress series more pressure on households trying to make those household budgets work. And working less hours is extremely unhelpful. So there is much more to see here than the official view. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.